This video is sponsored by Ground News. At the start of the week, Donald Trump sat down with European leaders for a high-stakes summit on the future of the Ukraine-Russia war. And to most people's surprise, the talks actually went kinda well, at least against the backdrop of just 6 months ago, when Zelensky's visit to the White House went, well, terribly.
You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
There was serious discussion about a new arms deal with the United States, and even the prospect of a direct meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin. The biggest breakthrough, though, was around the idea of security guarantees for Ukraine as part of a potential peace deal. For the first time, Washington seemed open about supporting such a proposal. But there was one clear condition. Europe would have to carry the bulk of that responsibility, with the US serving more as a backstop and coordinator than the primary enforcer. And in this video, we will look at what a European security guarantee might look like, and whether this could be the start of something bigger, the creation of a real European army. A security guarantee for Ukraine has been on leaders' minds for quite some time, and since the start of the year, a coalition of the willing has started to take shape. This isn't the European Union acting as a whole, though. Instead, it's a looser grouping of countries, led by UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, who want to move faster and more decisively than Brussels usually allows. That means some EU member states, like Hungary and Slovakia, are deliberately left out, while non-EU countries, most notably the United Kingdom, are brought in. And its purpose is to support the US-mediated peace talks by creating a credible security guarantee for Ukraine. That could mean stepping up military aid and making Ukraine super strong as the first line of defense. And then there's tightening sanctions, and if needed, even deploying European troops on the ground to make sure any ceasefire or peace deal actually holds. And this is the big question. What military force could Europe actually deploy to keep a potential peace in Ukraine? Because the frontline border today is 1,200 kilometers long, and it would require a lot of soldiers to defend such a long front line. The New York Times and the International Institute for Strategic Studies have sketched out 3 possible scenarios. The first idea is a full-blown peacekeeping force, a corps of 60 to 100,000 troops backed by heavy air and naval power. This would be defensive in nature, but the message to Moscow would be crystal clear. Any renewed attack would mean a direct clash not just with Ukraine, but with European and NATO soldiers as well. The second option is a so-called tripwire force. Much smaller, maybe 10,000 troops with strong air and naval support. On its own, this force could not stop a major Russian advance, but the theory is that Russia would hesitate to risk killing European troops, because that could trigger a much wider war. The flaw, of course, is that this is just a theory, and an untested one. And finally, the third option, an observer force, just a few hundred soldiers, mainly there to report on violations of any ceasefire. And obviously, such a small presence would not be able to defend itself in case of a serious attack. Now, whichever option is chosen, it will ultimately have to be carried by Europeans. As in recent days, JD Vance has made it super clear that Europe must shoulder the lion's share of responsibility for Ukraine's security. Donald Trump reinforced that message by assuring that the US will not send any ground troops to Ukraine for peacekeeping. And Steve Witkoff, Trump's negotiator, even claimed that Putin agreed to certain protections for Ukraine as part of the Trump summit. Not sure if the Russians see it that way, though. And this story has been reported by over 300 outlets, but the angles vary dramatically. If we look at the bias comparison, the right-leaning media have framed the talks as a major breakthrough, highlighting Trump's effectiveness as a mediator, while stressing the need for ongoing pressure on Russia. Meanwhile, left-leaning media have been a bit more cautious. They describe the talks as hopeful, but remain skeptical about how effective they'll be, while noting that it's positive to see Europe taking a more active role. And if I scroll down, I can see all of these articles mapped out clearly. The left, the center, and the right. And that's why I'm a huge fan of today's sponsor, Ground News. They cut through the media bias by showing exactly how stories are being covered across the political spectrum, so you'll never be trapped in a bubble. I especially like their factuality score. Every article, even podcast, is rated for accuracy. For example, here's one from the left-leaning politics podcast from Slate. The left bias is clear, but the information is still accurate. The Ground News app and website are packed with tools to help you cut through all of the noise and understand how and why stories are framed the way they are. If you'd like to give it a try, you can get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage plan by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Back to the video. At the moment, the most talked about option is option 2, a tripwire force of up to 10,000 soldiers. Both the UK and France have said they'd be willing to put troops on the ground if a peace deal is signed. And they already have an existing framework for that, the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, or CJEF. It's not a standing army. There's no permanent Franco-British brigade sitting around. Instead, it's a framework. The two militaries train together, line up their logistics, and agree on command structures in advance, so that units can be plugged in quickly if needed. At full scale, the CJEF could field about 10,000 troops. But of course, a force of 10 or even 25,000 soldiers is nowhere near enough to withstand a serious Russian attack. The German Institute for International and Security Affairs has estimated that it would actually take around 150,000 troops to properly secure Ukraine. That's far beyond even the largest option discussed so far. And if a future peace deal really did require that kind of deployment, Europe would have to go through a massive military transformation. In fact, it could mark the start of a genuine European military component. And this scale would require all main European powers to contribute. Think about it. For the first time, national armies in Europe would have to cooperate on a scale we've never seen before. A force of this size would require continuous brigade rotations, shared logistics, and long-term planning. Not just countries acting alone, but actually coordinating and depending on each other. Standardized equipment would become essential, pushing governments towards a shared military-industrial base, buying tanks, drones, artillery, and other systems together, rather than separately. And just imagine what Europe could learn directly from the Ukrainians on the front line. Lessons that could be transformed into European know-how. In fact, President Zelensky himself has been calling for this kind of cooperation for months.
I really believe that time has come. The armed forces of Europe must be created.
There would also have to be a shared European command. This time overseen by Europeans, not the usual NATO structure under a US Supreme Commander. The coalition would need its own joint headquarters, a unified chain of command, and clear rules of engagement. And over time, this could really start to look like an army of Europeans. In my previous video, I explained how this would be the third level of integration of our militaries. At the foundation, you'd still have the big national armies: France, Poland, Germany, and if it chooses, the United Kingdom. These national forces already exist and provide most of the combat power. But alongside them, the EU could establish a standing common force, not belonging to any one nation, but collectively owned and operated by Europe. That force could be around 100,000 soldiers strong, essentially the full-scale peacekeeping mission in Ukraine in option 1. And people could even be recruited straight into this army of Europeans, no matter which country they are from. Now, of course, this raises loads of questions. How would the command structure actually work? Who would be in charge? Germany? France? Or the EU institutions? And how would recruitment actually be organized? I've covered those questions in a detailed previous video, which I've linked above. But what is becoming increasingly clear is that the idea is starting to gain traction. Even Spain has now signaled that it would be on board. However, so far, very few countries are actually willing to commit that level of manpower to Ukraine. The only major players showing clear commitment are France, the UK, Belgium, Lithuania, Estonia, and Turkey. Then there are the maybes, countries like Sweden and Latvia, who first want clarity on what the mission would really be. Would it be peacekeeping, deterrence, or a reassurance force? Most of the others are hesitant and leaning towards a no. Italy has stepped back. Poland wants to keep most of its troops at home. And Germany says it can barely sustain its current mission in Lithuania, let alone anything bigger. And even if all the big NATO European countries were suddenly on board, Europe would still face a different problem. It simply lacks the key capabilities needed for a large-scale force. The International Institute for Strategic Studies has done a super detailed readiness assessment across the three force sizes, and the gaps are obvious. When it comes to long-range artillery, intelligence, and advanced information systems, Europe just does not have enough. So one point is super clear. Without US support in critical areas like air patrol, missile defense, and surveillance, such a mission simply would not be possible. This is what I think. I've long argued that Europe needs far deeper defense integration. It simply doesn't make any sense for every single EU country to duplicate the same structures. 27 different armies, 27 procurement chains, 27 sets of generals and headquarters. That's a huge waste of money, resources, and manpower. Pooling defense would mean more capability for less cost and a much stronger Europe. Europe has actually tried to build a European defense community twice before. The first attempt came in 1952, when 6 countries, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, signed a treaty to create a joint European army under a single command. It would have been revolutionary. No more national armies, but a truly shared force. Yet when it came to ratification, the French parliament rejected it, and the project collapsed. The second attempt was in the late 1990s, when French President Chirac and UK Prime Minister Blair launched plans for a European rapid reaction force. But here too, cooperation fizzled out. National politics, NATO dominance, and diverging strategic priorities meant the force never became what it was meant to be. So maybe this third time we will get lucky. And here's something fascinating we stumbled across. When the French Parliament killed the European defense community in 1954, the other 5 countries hadn't withdrawn. In fact, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg all ratified it. And Italy never actually rejected it. According to Professor Fabrini, an EU law scholar, this means the treaty is technically still alive under international law. 4 states already expressed consent to be bound by it and never rescinded that ratification. So in theory, if France and Italy ratified it today, the EDC could legally enter into force, even after more than 70 years. Yes, politically this is an impossible long shot. But legally though, the original plan for a European army is still sitting there, waiting to be picked up. So France and Italy, the ball is in your court. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to dig deeper into media bias and understand how stories are being framed, check out our sponsor, Ground News. You can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. And if you want to see our analysis of how a European army could work, from command structure to recruitment to deployment, check out our video here. Thank you so much to our presidents, Jan Chauke, Christian Peter, AGVD, Daniel Unite Europe, Stefan, and Rashid. See you in the next video.